hear of Chester, Pennsylvania mostly on the news. After passively receiving the negative coverage Chester has garnered over the years, we fit the small city of around 34,000 into a stereotype. I wish to present here, however, a different or more nuanced look at the city. What we do not often consider is Chester as a community, so, taking an ethnographic lens to my 10-week experience as a Chester Community Fellow with Swarthmore College's Lang Center for Civic and Social Responsibility, I aim to explore more deeply the historical, economic, social, and political legacies of the city. Further, I will connect these to my own work with children in a computer lab, blending together the more ethnographic and anthropological approaches as well as the practical approach. First, then, we go to the history. Chester is situated near lands originally settled by Lenni Lenape, Susquehannock, Shawnee, and Ohio Valley Native American tribes. Penn's Landing, additionally, though claimed by Philadelphia, can be identified as historically being in Chester. William Penn landed on North American soil in 1682, and Chester, as a full-fledged settlement, can be traced back to the year 1684. Originally called Upland, the region evolved and adapted as other cities did through the American Revolution, independence, and later periods and events. As a direct consequence of this, however, the Native American tribes originally occupying the land were largely dissolved by the 18th century and during that century. We study this basic history, which appears to be so temporally distant from the Chester of today, to gain a deeper understanding of the city's current situation. As any community is closely linked to its past, so is Chester. For instance, if we examine the McClure machine, led by Republican boss John McClure, we might gain a deeper understanding of the current political and economic climate in the city. As I will address later, the machine's control of the flow of resources created problematic and pertinent issues which the community dealt with through most of the 20th century and still continues to deal with in the 21st. Steeped in our discussion of history, we will now embark on one of economics. Elizabeth McLean Petrus, in a conference paper on Chester's consciousness of place, claims that the city's collective memory can be segmented into three periods described each in a single word, those being paternalism, patronage, and pillage. Paternalism describes the good old days, so to speak, when company bosses lived and interacted with the community. Sun Oil, Sun Ship, Scott Paper, all important companies in the early history of Chester, provided for their workers, treating them, quote, just well enough to keep them out of unions. We might envision the era of Boss McClure, which followed this, as rightly being the era of patronage. A drastic change from the previous period, the hands of business and government were shackled together and imprisoned by the political machine, such that jobs were given in exchange for votes, interviews for registrations. The people were now forced to accept the absurd suggestion that they were served by their managers and that any success or job was an optionally given favor. This was directly opposed to the manager's benevolence, even if this was misperceived during the previous state. Finally comes our current stage, or at the very least the current stage in 1991 when this paper was written, that being pillage. With the decline of bosses and the flight of businesses, Chester has plummeted into economic disarray. We see here that, statistically, higher proportions of people are out of the labor force in Chester than in the United States at large. The incomes, as noted before, of families in the city are depressed incredibly, measured by both median household and per capita measures to be around half of what the averages are for the whole country. In an attempt to get closer to the actual community behind these figures, though, we will now look at the social context of Chester. Looking to the demographics, we see that a large proportion of Black and Latino individuals reside in the city according to census data. Further, the largest age group, as we might expect, is that of people between 18 and 64. What is fascinating about this set of demographics, though, is that by a narrow margin of 3.2%, Chester has a higher proportion of children than the United States does, as well as a slightly lower percentage of those older than 65. This corresponds perhaps with the flight of higher income families between 1950 and 1980 towards more suburban areas. Eden, a nearby community, may help show this, as it has almost 14% of its population in the above 65 range, again compared to Chester's 10.4%. Thus, we can see that the city has a unique demographic portrait closely linked to its past. In Chester, additionally, on a sadder note, is the note of gun violence. Gun violence is a devastating issue, and it manifested itself one day during my class. A younger kid had pointed at his friend lightheartedly, not meaning anything, and another student, though older than him and initially uninvolved, saw the index finger pointed out and thumb pointed up as the shape of a gun. He started to cry, and we went into the hall to talk. As we sat down on a radiator on the wall, he told me that his brother had been shot that weekend. I was completely silent, and I didn't know what I could or should say. Still, looking back, I'm not sure what I could have said that would have helped the situation at all. Gun violence is an issue, but it is also an epidemic which tragically affects and threatens to fracture victims, families, and communities. Just as important, but on a more hopeful note, are the strides made in civil rights by the community. We often neglect in popular discourse that Chester had its own civil rights movement led by George Raymond. The city also hosted the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his seminary training. The latter especially is a point of great pride for many in the community, and the church King learned at is still operational. So, as much negative attention as Chester receives, we must still recognize that it has a modern legacy of social action. Also important to note here is the notion of space in Chester. Recently, I wrote a paper on how our South Philadelphian community of Mexican immigrants' production of the Good Friday Via Crucis redefined the new streets as sacred and community space. I believe that the same is conceptually, even if not directly, true here. The people's shared spaces, such as the public schools and churches, and histories of action within them, rather than in externally imported spaces such as the Philadelphia Soul Stadium, must be recognized by those attempting to lend a service to the community. These spaces are, after all, birthplaces of change. Moving briefly to Chester's government, I wish to begin by addressing the impact of McClure's Republican machine once again. Chester, as a result of the boss's influence, was a Republican stronghold for a long time. In my class, however, the political discussions among the children, fueled by, no doubt, the spectacles we legitimize as conventions, were consistently anti-Republican nominee Donald Trump and pro-Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton. A brief glance at the percent of people who voted in the 2016 presidential primaries reveals that, in Chester, 81.9% of individuals cast ballots on the Democratic side of the ticket. This means an overwhelming majority of the primary voters were registered Democrats, as compared to a slim minority in the whole of Delaware County. Combined with a larger number of Democratic city officials, we might claim that the population of Chester has largely disavowed themselves of the machine which once controlled their votes, their jobs, and their lives. Bridging the political and social scenes in Chester is the Chester Housing Authority. Operated under the guidance of a board of commissioners and executive director Steve Fisher, the organization manages housing developments and other properties to serve families and senior citizens in Chester. The Housing Authority also holds a variety of programs for both residents and non-residents, including lessons on the Ruth L. Bennett Community Farm, Anumi fitness classes which include Zumba, and a summer meals program which provides free breakfast and lunch to Chester children. Filling the space between these meals were the computer classes I led at the Bennett Community Center. After developing and modifying curricula based on the Mount Laurel School's technology curriculum and Code.org's computer science curriculum, I taught between 1 and 16 children 4 days a week. The students created and formatted documents on Google Drive, wrote basic code through Code.org's Blockly system, and learned the basic tenets of digital citizenship, including how the internet works, how to be safe online, and how to use crowdsourcing to complete a task more effectively. All of the lessons, as I designed them, had the goal of helping the students to be producers of technology rather than just consumers, to be programming rather than programmed. While, certainly, some days were more difficult than others, as this picture probably shows, the times when students got it or were amazed to see their abstract work on a computer become more concrete in the form of a poster or game were incredibly rewarding. Impactful as well were the moments outside of the general curriculum. I had brought in a few games and puzzles one day for the students to play with during free time, and 2 younger cousins had chosen those pictured here to assemble. It took a large part of their morning for them to do so. But when they finish, they ask that the puzzles remain exactly where they were, precariously close to the edge of a table until the next day. Seeing them work together to complete both of these and their excitement upon finishing them reminded me that, despite the situations affecting the children in Chester, kids are still kids, and nobody should take that childhood away. When I first took the bus to Chester, I took 2 pictures from my bus stops in Swarthmore in the city. I am amazed looking back at my own initial obsession with the contrast between what I knew and what was new to me. Later that week, though, I took another picture which has only grown more present with time. While coming home one day, I saw presumably a father and a son get on the 109. They sat down a few rows in front of me, and the man immediately reminded me of my own dad, coolly pointing out signs and buildings to the child. After my work in Chester, I know that this is the picture which captures the community I met and interacted with. Chester is, as all communities are, one engaged in the well-being and future of its youth. So, at the end of my ethnographic look at Chester, I wish to conclude that the narrative of space is especially important in the city's historical and modern experience. Even more so is the impact of children occupying that space. Where children can be free to be proud of something that they made, to play games together and watch as their parents show them the world, must be a space to feel comfortable in, and is consequently one defined by them, their presence, and their interactions within it. Despite the intrusion of space-occupying external entities or the crippling legacies of gun violence and economic and political machinations as are in Chester, I feel that so long as the kids are free to be kids in Chester, there is hope for the community and the community's future.